autistic people lack empathy. That's a load of shit. Autistic people don't lack empathy, they process empathy differently and develop empathy differently from non-autistic people. In fact, very often, autistic people are actually hyper-empathetic in emotional empathy, which is about sharing the feelings of other people, which can often lead them to avoid eye contact or not deal or cope or manage very well with other people's extreme emotions because it makes them feel it themselves. They may struggle sometimes to have a language, a name, have more cognitive empathy skills, particularly early on in their development. But like with all autistic traits, this is really variable from person to person. I was very fortunate when I first started working with autistic young people back in 2007, because I was in a setting that had lots of different young people, different ages, different neurotypes, and I got the opportunity to work with a number of autistic people who showed me how variable the autistic experience is, and reminded me that at the end of the day, autistic people are people and all people are different. Right from the start, when I was going on training courses that would highlight an autistic lack of empathy, lack of theory of mind, the ability to sort of read the thoughts and emotions and intentions of others, it didn't make much sense. And one of the reasons it didn't make a lot of sense was when I was supporting autistic young people, perhaps who were becoming dysregulated, I felt very early on that how I interacted with them, the level of emotional expression I was giving and what kind of emotional expression I was giving made a big difference. Because autistic people are often actually hyper-empathetic, it's really important that we manage our non-verbal communication. The way you stand, body language and non-verbal communication often conveys emotion. Your proxemics. When someone's hyper-empathetic, it's actually really important that we pay attention to how we move, how we talk, to what we do with our body. The tone you use. What we do with our hands whilst we're talking.
How loud you're speaking.
Eye contact.
Whether you're speaking really fast or fairly slowly.
Facial expressions. If we assume that the autistic person lacks empathy, there's a danger that we don't focus on that or don't think that it plays a role. That was why it was so important for me to try and manage my emotional level, both internally and through what I was doing in terms of my behaviour, my tone of voice, my body language, all of those kind of things, trying to share my calm rather than join them in that chaos. So it didn't make sense. It also didn't sound very nice, just as a general baseline point of reference to use about people. Luckily, in 2015, I came across a paper called the empathy imbalance hypothesis, which really highlighted where this kind of misunderstanding around empathy was. See, based on the Ike empathy model and the empathy imbalance hypothesis, we can think of empathy as having different levels, different aspects, different areas. You've got cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy is that understanding, having a language, a literacy for your emotions, to recognize emotions in others and give them a name. Then you've got emotional empathy. Emotional empathy is based on studies on things called mirror neurons in the brain, which fire in response to the emotions of others. Feeling with people. You see an emotion in someone else, it connects with something in yourself. In Ike's model, you've also got compassionate empathy, which is kind of problem solving with feelings. If someone feels a certain way, knowing how to perhaps help them feel better, how to help yourself feel better, a kind of self-regulation, but also compassion for others. Cognitive empathy is your language. It's how you read emotions off others, read non-verbal cues, and have an articulation for your own emotional state. And that was found in the empathy imbalance hypothesis, and is something in practice with young people you will see day to day, where perhaps they have a feeling, have an emotional behavioural response, but aren't able to explain why or name that feeling easily. from a young age. It's something they can develop later on, and again, every autistic person is different, but as a general kind of rule, you often get autistic people that will talk of having an experience called alexithymia, where they don't have a name for certain feelings. There are interoception difficulties around reading the internal signals of the body for some autistic people. So as a whole, that kind of naming and labeling side of empathy probably is something that takes more support to develop, isn't as instinctive, or isn't at the forefront of their attention. But then you have emotional empathy and feeling with people. And again, the empathy and balance hypothesis showed a clear difference in autistic people, but for the majority of them, it was actually a hypersensitivity, a hyper focus, if you like, a hyper response. They were more in tune with people in that empathetic sense. So they would soak up the feelings of others. The mirror neuron response would be higher. I worked with one woman who finished the session, and as she was walking away, she was kind of looking at the floor whilst I was talking, and I said, you know, it's not a problem at all. I'm just interested why you're now looking at the floor when I'm talking to you. And she said, because I can't listen to you and watch you at the same time. You're too much. In the empathy and balance hypothesis, you had examples from people talking about eye contact being painful. One autistic lady gave the sort of really nice description of, if I look at you and you're sad, I'll be sad, and I don't want to risk being sad. So there's all these kind of experiences that show that hyper empathy. So again, to say an autistic person has less empathy is not only unfair, too general, but it's incorrect. You know, it depends what level of empathy you're talking about, and compassionate empathy, and that's probably something we're all developing throughout our lives. So autistic people lack empathy, not true at all. And actually it can be a really misleading and damaging idea that we need to readdress.